About 3 years ago, I did a 6-day solo trip in the Trinity Alps from Hobo Gulch to Grizzly Lake, and back out, it was a beautiful place that I would recommend. But this was my first solo backpacking trip where there was no one else around. I'd done a couple of overnighters to test gear in Point Reyes and Henrico, but there were always other hikers around it that decidedly unprimitive camps in Trinity. It was completely primitive. I just found flat places to build fire pits with running water nearby. I was unprepared for how terrifying it is to be in the woods alone, with no one for miles. I've been backpacking since I was 6, and I'd love to stay up late around a fire and chat. But alone in Trinity, as soon as the sun went down, I could not stop looking out into the darkness. I found myself eating quickly as soon as the sun went down and diving into the tent before 8 p.m., just to shake the uncanny feeling that this particular dark was somehow different from all the other nights spent backpacking. Now I like being scared, so this wasn't actually too much of a negative for me. I began to anticipate the creepy thrills of nighttime, until the third night I found a big wide meadow where two trails converged that had a few fire rings set up. But I decided to keep going for a mile until I found a small glade. A few hundred yards off the trail, I made myself dinner as usual and started to get the chills when the sun went down. I took to panning my light at the horizon every few minutes, sweeping the woods as I was preparing to pack it in. I took one last pan with the headlamp and caught the reflection of two eyes just beyond the tree line. I stared as they were particularly wide set and staring right back at me. I held them in the light, assuming they would bolt, but the reflection stayed perfectly still. I started to walk forward, making a lot of noise and shouting, hoping to spook whatever was watching me as I approached. I realized they were slightly farther off the ground than I thought, making it a few feet tall, at least with eyes as wide as a person's. I really had to push myself to keep walking. I felt almost dizzy with dread. My headlamp was dim thanks to a short after a heavy rain, so I couldn't see any details until I got right up on it. It wasn't an animal. It was a person wearing a pair of glasses, not sunglasses, but thick eyeglasses with delicate wire frames, standing next to a stump in the middle of the trees, right next to a glade that was hundreds of yards from the nearest trail and about 15 miles from any trailhead in the middle of the isolated parkland. He was just standing there motionless, staring at my fire. I promptly went back into my tent in hopes this person would go away, as I grabbed my pocket knife and sat down. I didn't sleep a wink that night, as I still felt like I was being stalked. I didn't want to check, however, given the fact there was some random lunatic staring at my campsite in the middle of nowhere. The next day, I packed up the site and relocated about 5 miles closer to where I came from. I took this trip during peak season, and I didn't see another person except for a hunter on horseback on a far ridge. For all 6 days, I still wonder how the person with the glasses got there so perfectly still. Far from any established camper trail, I still don't have a good answer. I had to get my brother to help her count this story as I was 12. At the time this happened, about 6 years ago, when I was about 12 and my brother was 26. My brother had been serving in the U.S. Army for several years when this happened and was deploying to the Middle East on his second deployment, if I remember correctly. Something to also note is that he was a Green Beret and had recently, 3 or 4 months prior to this trip, completed the Army Special Forces qualification course, and by then was an active duty SF engineer. Sergeant, definitely not someone you want to mess with. Given that we both grew up with a passion for the outdoors, he thought it would be nice to take me on a backpacking trip in northern Alabama. The trip had gone smoothly up until the third night when we were camping out around 8 p.m. We had our camp set up eating dinner and were sitting by the fire talking about typical stuff. For some reference, our spot was about 50 yards from a large stream and about 50 yards downhill, adjacent to the large path, our camp. The stream and the path formed a triangle of sorts. This was summertime in Alabama, so it wasn't quite dark. Yet when two guys who looked to be in their late 20s wandered up and asked if we had seen any hogs while we were hiking around. Given that this is rural Alabama, we actually had seen some farther into the wilderness area and told them. So even though they were relatively polite, I got a seriously creepy vibe from the dirty clothes, greasy hair, and scraggly facial hair. I think they probably looked like they belonged in the movie Deliverance. They kind of hung out for a few minutes, maybe a little longer than they should. have just looking around asking us questions like how long we had been out there, and how long we were staying, and what looked like them to be kind of sizing us up. They then abruptly said goodbye and walked away. I didn't necessarily feel threatened by them, and I know for sure my brother didn't, but I still felt uneasy about the whole thing. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours, my brother and I had gone to sleep and were nestled in our tent when I woke to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, and they sounded like they were only about 100 yards away. My heart immediately started pounding, and I kicked my brother through my sleeping bag and asked if he was awake and had heard the dogs. He responded, "I'm awake. They've been getting closer for the past hour, so just lay still and don't make any sounds." Needless to say, 12-year-old me was extremely scared. We would also hear sporadic shouts from several different sources, but neither came any closer. Few minutes later, my brother whispered, "They're just hunting for hogs. They use the dogs to pin them down when they shoot them." This gave me some relief, but not much. Somehow, I managed to fall back asleep. The fact that they were doing this at night was a huge red flag, my brother later told me, but I think he was just trying to keep me calm. Fast forward to about another 3 hours. It was now around 2 a.m. I had managed to sleep pretty well after first hearing the hog hunters when I woke up to my brother squeezing my shoulder firmly, saying, "Wake up, put your shoes on, quick and follow me. Be as quiet as you can." My heart immediately went back to racing because I heard the dogs of voices in the distance farther away before, but still distinct, not asking any questions. I did what he said, and as soon as we were out of the tent, he told me to get on his back. We snuck about 50 yards into the woods towards the junction of the path on the stream and crawled into some bushes. It was an uphill hike, so we had a pretty good elevated view of our campsite. I remember as we were laying there, how loudly I was breathing and how quiet he was when I heard the very distinct sound of a pistol slide racking. I looked over, and my brother had his pistol and was watching the campsite and surrounding area. I started to whisper to him when he put his hand over my mouth and pointed at the campsite. The group of hunters had been steadily approaching our camp, and by this time, 30 minutes or so had finally arrived. There were 5 of them, and like 3 or 4 dogs, they all looked relatively young, but 2 either had rifles or shotguns, and the dogs were going crazy, obviously having smelled our scent for those of you who aren't backpackers or campers. Nobody who comes up on a random camp in the middle of the night with dogs and guns has good intentions. I knew this. My brother obviously knew this too. I was beyond scared. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but my brother later told me that they were talking about us, although he hadn't heard any specifics either. They lingered for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around and talking to themselves, and my brother put his mouth to my ear and said, "If they come towards you, I want you to turn and run as quickly as you can. Don't stop, don't look back, stay off the trail, look for the flashing lights." I didn't know what he meant by this, but I nodded I knew I could make it back because he had taught me the land navigation pretty well. He then handed me a flashlight and told me not to take the red filter off. He told me later that the red filter helps preserve night vision and cuts down ambient light. So it'd be harder for someone to see me from a distance at this point. I was so scared I was almost crying, but at the same time had a rush of adrenaline and what I think now was confidence that he thought I could handle myself. We laid there for a while longer, when out of nowhere, they started screaming, "Where are you?" and firing. Into the woods at random, my brother dragged me behind the crest of the hill and threw himself up on top of me. Thankfully, due to the position, we were on the top of the hill. We were protected by any gunfire. They shot maybe 5 or 6 more times and then started walking back the direction they had come. They got maybe 100 yards away when I heard a blaring siren and saw emergency lights flashing through the woods. It turns out my brother had called the Forest Service office on a satellite phone my family has for emergencies while I was asleep, and they had sent out Forest Service officers and game wardens to our area of the wilderness. The Sipsey Wilderness is about 25,000 acres in size, so it took them a while to get there on the dirt roads. When we saw the game warden truck, my brother signaled them with the light and pointed them in the direction the hunters had gone, and the guy sped off, shining his spotlight through the woods as soon as they were all gone. We went back to our camp, packed up our stuff, and waited by the path for the game warden to come back, who then gave us a ride in the truck bed back to the main staging area. On the drive back, my brother told me how brave I had been and that we would talk about it with our parents the next day if we wanted to. I asked him not to do that because I thought they might never let me go camping again. When I was in 8th grade, I went to a school that had a wooded area next to it that separated the school grounds from the neighborhood I used to have to walk through the wooded area to get home from school every day. This was back in the 80s when jean jackets were popular. I had a pretty awesome jean jacket that had several buttons and patches sewn on it from various bands I liked. It was similar to Judd Nelson's jacket from the Breakfast Club. One day after school, I was making my way through the wooded area. It was not unusual back then for me to stare at the ground when I walked, so I often did not see what was in front of me. What got my attention first was the sound, the dull thudding sound coming from a few feet ahead. As I made my way through the heavy brushing trees, I came across an older kid who looked to be high school age, wearing a jean jacket very similar to mine. He was covered in dirt, not like he was playing in mud, but like he hadn't bathed in a long time. He had long and stringy hair matted to his head. I assumed he was homeless. He had his back turned to me, and the thudding I was hearing was him driving a hunting knife into the tree in front of him. Slowly, over and over, I froze for a split second when I saw him and decided to back away and get out of there. But then it was too late. He heard me coming and snapped his head around and looked right at me. The first thing I noticed was how dark the red rings around his eyes were. It looked like he hadn't slept in days. He got very excited when he saw me. His lips curled into this sort of half smile that showed a few yellowing, crooked teeth I wanted to run. But I was so scared to move, I watched as he looked over at me and followed his gaze as he settled on my jacket. At that point, he became fixated on it. He said, "Cool jacket, man," drawing out each word slowly. It sounded like "cool jacket, man." Not so much of a statement, but as three separate words. I sheepishly mustered a thanks. He moved closer to me, and all I could do was stare at the blade in his hand. At that point, I'm pretty sure he had completely forgotten he was still holding it. I was frozen in place, and when he got close enough to smell his pungent breath, he walked around me in a wide circle. He didn't actually touch me, but just circled around me. While staring at my jacket, he then stepped back and got a wide grin on his face. I was beyond scared. He then dropped the knife and proceeded to pull off his own jacket, revealing a torn-up and filthy Iron Maiden shirt underneath. I also noticed he had cross-hatched scars all over his arms and hands. They extended all the way down to his fingers. To his dirt and blackened fingernails, he said, "Trade me in that gravy one word at a time tone." He then sat on the ground and proceeded to cut a dirty, worn Metallica patch off his own jacket with a knife he had dropped. I was too scared to argue with him, so I just watched as he furiously sliced at the sewn patch on his jacket. After a couple minutes, he wrenched the patch free and held it out to me, expecting me to take it, which I did reluctantly. He then smiled up at me, still sitting on the ground with his knife in hand. "Now give me your jacket once again." I looked at the knife in his hand. I considered running, but he was much bigger than me, and I wasn't the fastest, so I knew he'd easily catch me in a foot race. I silently removed my jacket and handed it to him. He looked it over and then went for the one patch I really hoped he would skip. It was a Pink Floyd patch my older brother Bobby when we went to the Delicate Sound of Thunder concert the previous year. It was not the first time I had been faced with a situation that made me feel helpless, but nonetheless, it was devastating watching him shred the patch off the back of my jacket when you finished cutting off the patch. You dropped the knife again and stood up. I fully expected him to keep my jacket, but he just handed it back to me. He smiled at me again and said, "Thanks, man." He then scooped up his knife, put his own jacket back on, and then turned and walked away. I stood there for a long time. I felt helplessness, anger, and shame. I was still scared, but mostly sad. I tossed a Metallica patch on the ground, but then I got irrationally scared that the kid would come back and see that I discarded it and come after me. So I picked it back up and stuck it in my pocket. It was a slow, depressing walk home. I never told my mom why I was upset. Until now, I never mentioned anyone. What happened that day, she got mad at me when she found out that I lost the Pink Floyd badge. But I didn't think she would believe me if I told her what happened to it. So I kept it to myself. I never saw that kid again. But from that day on, I always took home.